Yeah, I've been on a few stages in my time, but probably never quite so nervous as I am being on this one. It's a bit of a different environment for me, and what I want to talk about today is just why we've ended up doing the Wildfarmed project and how we got there. I'm slightly apprehensive because I've only been farming for 15 years, and so speaking in front of all of you, all I'm going to do is tell you the process that I've been through, why we've ended up doing what we're doing, in case parts of the journey can avoid repeated mistakes that I've made already, and to put in context the pasture cropping system that we ended up with. So this all began about 15 years ago when I was coming back from a gig actually, and I read an article about the industrial food production system, if you want to call it that, which ended with the line that's on the screen: if you don't like the system, don't depend on it. And that led me into a world of sort of self-sufficiency, John Seymour, and the idea of growing food for the family. And that didn't go too well at the beginning. My neighbours ploughed the field up for me, rotavated it, field of weeds. That slowly evolved into Charles Dowding, no dig, companion planting, and so on. And we ended up with a situation where there was quite a lot of diversity and abundance for not a lot of work. And I started selling vegetables at the market and just fell in love with the story of the soil and the subject that we're all here to share. And the more I did that, the more I realized the slow catastrophe that was unfolding in the fields around me, which in that part of southwest France is maize. It's been growing maize there for a very long time, and the consequences of that are not pretty to see. And so I decided to sell my publishing rights to, with kind of looking back on it, hopeless naivety really, to buy a farm in the southwest of France, which had 0.5% organic matter, found that out afterwards, and 110 hectares of basically land that had been in maize production pretty much continuously. In that context, in the kind of tsunami wave of information that you're faced with when you step into this world for the first time, I kind of forgot the lessons that I'd learned from the vegetable patch about not disturbing the soil, companion planting, diversity, and so on, and essentially did a kind of non-plough organic arable operation with some sort of interesting angles insofar as this is wheat sown with the Claydon drill that was weeded with a Garford hoe. So I had a few things like that that were kind of working okay as far as it went, but the system just wasn't working. The soil was so degraded that nature was responding with the things that we know it responds with: thistles, dock leaves, all the most tenacious of weeds. And the one that kind of finished me off was this weed, which is called datura. I don't know if it even exists in the UK, but it's a French, it's very common in irrigated maize fields. And this was an absolutely critical soybean harvest. The field began to fill up with tens, hundreds, thousands of these weeds, which mean that you can't sell your soybeans because they're highly toxic. I started pulling them out by hand, and then got my friends to pull them out by hand, and then I ended up with this kind of fly mows on a beam borrowed from the neighbour to cut above the soybeans. And about halfway through that, on a very hot day, I realised the utter futility of what I was engaged in. And that would have been the end had I not come across this book by Albert Howard, which was an utter inspiration. And from that, there were many things that inspired me, but the key takeaway was that we need to have plants and animals together. So before giving up, I said to my long-suffering wife that I wanted to try and get some cattle and get some herbal lays down there and see if we could not turn this thing around. The herbal lay mix was inspired by Newman Turner and his fertility farming book. Went to some lengths to try and put that mix together until I realized that Cotswold Seeds sold it ready-made. And so we got the cows over, and we used Red Sussex because I knew nothing about livestock at that point. And I had a friend, Tim Hassel, who was farming a Goodwood estate. He had Red Sussex, so I knew that breed could thrive on a 100% grass-fed diet, and I knew that's what I wanted to do. So to eliminate at least one unknown, I went for Red Sussex. The other challenge we were faced with was total lack of shade. So this is a an aerial photo of the farm, and all the trees and hedges have been removed, as is so often the case. And so initially, to deal with the shade problem, we constructed from the central stable area that you can probably just about make out, single wire corridors on all the main axes going all around the farm, so that the cattle can autonomously go between the day's pasture, which we define by just lifting up the single wire and putting the daily fence lines down. They can go to and from the stable when they want to get some shade. And an unintended bonus of that system, so I'm not doing their nobility as animals much favors with the speeded up video, but I just want you to give you the idea. And so when they get to the wire that's lifted up, they just totally take care of themselves. All I've got to do is move the wire. So an unintended bonus of that was water, because they can just go and drink when they want. I haven't got to haul any water around or spend ages burying pipes. So that's been a fantastic system, which has allowed very opportunistic grazing, and the tightness of the daily moves, whether it's 1, 2, or 3, will depend on, like here, where we're going over stubbles and really want to recycle all the straw and the grass. Well, that's before sowing, again, trying to get it down super tight. Or here's more of a springtime move where we're just trying to get around the farm fast. But that has all been really, really easy to manage thanks to the corridor system. Alongside that, we started planting miles of hedges and agroforestry strips, and the hedges have been great. The agroforestry strips were sort of standard 30-meter bands of fruit trees, hazelnut, stuff like that, which have been okay until I met this man. And I just mentioned this in passing. Agroforestry is definitely not my speciality, but he came to the farm. Ernst Gotch is a Swiss guy, been living in Brazil for 40 years, where he bought 500 hectares of burnt down Amazon kind of for a fiver sort of thing, and started planting trees, and has done that for 40 years and developed a whole system of agroforestry. And just the whole way that he plants trees and shrubs in association, and the actual physical way that he plants trees was fascinating. We did this little plot on our farm. That's the trees, you can't really see them, but planted into a bean cover crop, and that's the same plot a year later. And the dynamism in his plantation compared to the more standard stuff I was doing before has been amazing. So I definitely recommend checking Ernst Gotch out if you're interested in agroforestry. So parallel to the mob grazing, again through Albert Howard, I come across J.I. Rodale, founder of the Rodale Institute, and through him, Jeff Moyer, who was doing the no-till organic farming using the crimper roller. So I got myself an I&J roller and started to do that, and tried to adapt that to the southwest of France. And that works. That's a great system. And without too many setbacks, this was a cover crop of vetch. The top right-hand corner was the rolled vetch, the crimper rolled, and the slits in it are where the drill had gone straight into that. And you can see the maize growing through that nicely. Even quite late on in the season, the vetch is doing a good job there, keeping things clean, retaining moisture. It's actually not a great reflection on my soil that vetch has taken so long to break down. But one of the advantages of degraded soils is that legumes will just outcompete everything, and the mulch stays there for a long time. So there are at least a few upsides. I did the same thing with soybeans into rolled rye. Again, that worked well and compared very favourably with the cultivated sort of test that I'd done next to it. And then the allelopathic effects of certain plants. This was a very badly harvested field of buckwheat, which had lots and lots of regrowth. You can see in the top left-hand corner. But there was only buckwheat, so I direct drilled some barley into there, and after the first frost, you can see the buckwheat is gone, and I didn't do anything after that, and that was what the barley was like at the end of the cycle. So those experiments were working well, and were completed with a visit to a French guy called Joseph Pousset, sort of farmer philosopher, and his whole thing is about kind of a forest principle, really, filling all canopies of the field. So this is crimson clover, oats, and rye, all of which will be harvested together. And so between all of those techniques, I could see a way in which we could do a kind of successful no-till organic system, the problem was that even despite the reduced passes, in my heavily degraded clay soils, there were lots of wheelings, basically, and I didn't want to start cultivating again. And so I got a bit obsessed about how to be lighter on the field, and that's what led to going to see the Amish and seeing if we could do all this with horses. Now, I only mentioned this is not the story about today, I just mentioned this because this little chapter had implications in terms of the pasture cropping thing that came out the other end. So this is the visit to Amish, that's the kids going back from school, so you can see their horsemanship starts at a young age. So we came back from there convinced that we could do it. I mean, I'd never ridden a horse, but my long-standing friend Thierry, who you can see there, he knew a lot about horses, so we decided to train the horses together. These were Percherons being raised for meat. But eventually we got to the point where we could harness them up as a team. Things got pretty efficient. It took about 20 minutes to get out in the field, and we ended up being able to successfully use equipment between 2.5 and 3 meters wide at about 5 kilometers an hour. So it really has the potential to be a viable alternative on reasonable areas. This is potentially a world first of horses with GPS, but the reason I mention that is simply that you're faced with interesting problems, and one is the lack of power, and so as a result of that, you have to look for different solutions. So in this instance, this was a cover crop of vetch again. Now rolling that with the horses is easy, but was no way we could pull a drill that'd be heavy enough to get through all that rolled vetch. So in this instance, we thought, well, we'll just broadcast the buckwheat into the standing vetch and roll the vetch afterwards, so the seed is trapped between the mulched cover crop and the soil, and will that be enough to get it away? And the result of that was, you can see the buckwheat coming up through the rolled vetch, and that's what it looked like through the crop. And it's not a perfect stand, but considering the tiny amount of effort and energy that's gone into that field, is acceptable. The problem with all of that was that, meanwhile, in the mob grazed pastures, the regenerative power of herbal lays mob grazed compared to a succession of annual plants, even crimper rolled, mulched, and so on, was absolutely striking. And I'd already seen the guy before me had some cows, but who never went any further than the one bit of a field that was in front of the stables, which is now part of a bigger field, and you go from sticky clay to black soil to sticky clay when you go down that field. So I was just really struck by the power of perennial plants and pastures to turn things around. This was backed up by the thistles revelation. I had a terrible field of Canadian thistles that are basically taken over the whole field. I tried everything to get rid of those. And in the end, just getting it down to a herbal lay and grazing it correctly, after a year, there was just none to be seen. Now, I'd read this idea that you change the soil biology and plants disappear because they don't need to be there, and it sounded hopelessly utopian to me. But having seen that, that was an absolute revelation. And there's a guy in New York State called Klaus Martins, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but he's got some superb reflections on that and lots of examples of that in action. I'd also, like many of us, I'm sure, read Gabe Brown's book, where it's been a while since I've read it, but it's the farms 1, 2, and 3 have been in no-till for 25 years, I think it's that, and farm 4 anyway is the one where there are pastures, and the numbers there, they speak for themselves. And the final bit of my reflections on perennial versus annual is best summed up with a slightly stupid slide that I use for school kids who come to the farm. But nevertheless, it kind of says what needs to be said about perennial plants as opposed to annual plants. And so all of this combined with the fact that I didn't have the power in the horses to actually go and plough up my pastures and do a couple of years arable or 3 years arable before going back to pasture again, meant that I didn't do what I thought I was going to do, which was based on this book, which is that classic sort of rotation, if you like, of pasture into arable and back into pasture again. And instead, parallel to all this, I'd been growing old wheat varieties, just because I'd visited a Jean-François Berthelot, who's the kind of French equivalent of John Letts, if you like, and John Letts has been saving, multiplying finding these competitive, fantastic wheat varieties for a very long time. Other people, Andy Forbes in the UK, Anders Borgen in Denmark, all doing this vital work. And it's, I think, you know, not just in the cereal world, but one of the things that struck me coming into agriculture from the outside is that we're trying to grow plants in competitive environments, and we don't have varieties capable of doing that. So I think all the people that are doing this work in all these fields is absolutely critical. So I'd exchanged seeds with all these people, and also with a local paysan boulanger who kept his wheat, his family wheat from back in the day. And I started sowing this direct into grass to see if I could get around this problem of not having to turn my pastures over. In the first instance, we used an Aitchinson grass farmer adapted. You can just about see there to be able to a pull type. So in other words, horse-drawn. And we tightly grazed the pasture and sowed directly into it. And what normally happened was that it looked great for a while. And then spring happened, and it didn't look so good anymore. And there was various different versions of that kind of failure, where we can get it away really nicely in the autumn, but then everything catches up. And at that point, I was thinking about swapping the understory of these cereals to clover, inspired by the One Straw Revolution guy, and also by a farm that I saw in California doing the same thing. But I didn't want to do that for different reasons. I have to credit Cotswold Seeds with this photo that I stole from their website. But I wanted a different rooting depths. I wanted a diversity of plants because the cows were going to come in and out of these fields, so I didn't want it to be sort of grazing a monoculture. And then the whole soil biology question, I don't pretend to understand the full details of all that. I like that quote from Chris Nichols, who said that 10 years ago she thought she understood about 1% of what was happening in the soil, and now she thinks she understands about 1/10 of 1%. But what we do know is that a diversity of plants in soil that's disturbed as little as possible does the trick. And so I wanted to really try and hang on to this diversity. So the next step was to try grazing really heavily up to growth stage 31. And so we grazed the wheat 2, sometimes even 3 times before that point. And that started to get really good results. So that's unsown pasture on the left and sown pasture on the right. You can see here where we left too much space between drill passes. There's a lot going on under the wheat. But, and we'll come back to this, as long as it stays upright, it's a nice system. But that butt is quite a significant butt. So that started to work a bit better. And so we invested in high-tech cleaning equipment to try and add value and, we'll basically add value to these grains, initially through flour. Having set that mill up, a great hassle and expense, I went to see Jean-François Berthelot to tell him about my success, and he said, you need to change that mill straight away because it's reconstituted granite and you need actual granite, otherwise the flour quality won't be up for it. So that was another little setback. So we did that, but then even then I struggled to sell the flour because it was quite weak for conventional bakers, and so that's what led to making bread. And that's what led to the evolution of a kind of farm shop and ecosystem, where we ended up with 8 members of staff on the 110 hectares, and we supplied a lot of schools, and we had school visits coming to see where their bread came from. And it was kind of a happy ending, except that when my friends Ed and George, now colleagues in Wildfarmed, they came to the farm, we talked about the things that I'd been finding out and discovering. When we got our head out of our little farm world and started looking around, this is what you see down there. And it's a bit ahead of the soil erosion curve compared to the UK. It's the combination of fields that are left bare for 6 months of the year often, and a harsh climate, and very intensive conventional agriculture, and it's not pretty. And that's a field of oilseed rape. You can see the bedrock showing through. And those oak trees are finding tens of thousands of litres of water from somewhere, and there's not enough moisture in that field to make one seed of rape germinate. So the situation down there is fairly stark. This is the neighbour's farm just at the end of mine, where he reclaimed a little patch of land from the neighbour. So if you look on your left, you can see it's quite green, and there's a very clear stripe between the newly reclaimed land and the land that's been a field for a while. And when you go up the hill, you go from that in the newly reclaimed land. It looks like that as you go further up the hill. And when you get to the top, it's like that, which in close-up looks like that. So, I mean, it really is kind of the beginning of desertification. And so, looking at that situation, our thoughts were, how can we help to deal with the cultural and financial barriers for these people, my neighbouring farmers there, to change system, basically. And that seemed to come down to two things. One was to build a simple and reliable version of the pasture cropping system, so these fields could get covered up with protective layer of pasture as fast as possible. And the other bit was to try and create a market for quality, which means that farmers can get paid properly without having to add to all of their stuff they're doing already, the whole other layer of direct consumer relations. And it was those two thoughts that led to the setting up of Wildfarmed Grain. The first bit of that was to try and think about the farming side and create a new version of the pasture cropping thing. So the horses got a holiday, which unfortunately is still ongoing to my great sadness. But basically we had to deal with the lodging risk, and that led to thoughts about mowing between the rows, and that led to thoughts about wide spacings, and all that culminated in what is a Swiss maize strip till unit with an old grain drill that we had bolted onto the back. And those spacings are not total insanity. It was based on this test done by Monosem when they were testing their twin row maize drill, and they did a wheat trial for some reason. I don't know why they did that, but they did a wheat trial and they got 7.5 tons a hectare from exactly the same spacings, which is 75 centimetre centres. So obviously that's a different scenario. They're throwing everything at that. That's conventional agriculture with a capital C. But it did seem that if we could get the necessary tillering on the plants, the spacings should be able to work. So you can just about make it out there, sowed into the pasture using that method and grazed as before until growth stage 31, and then started building an inter-row mower to deal with the grass competition from there to harvest. This was the first prototype, a little bit Heath Robinson, and it suffered from being behind the tractor, which in terms of how your neck feels at the end of the day is one thing, but also mowing grass after you've driven over it is never ideal. So we had to get that into a hydraulic system and get it on the front of the tractor, and ended up using these mowers that are used by vineyard guys, so they're pretty robust. And that worked pretty well, and that's the mower in action. And while we were running these tests, working with Ollie Field, a farmer friend, our farmer now friend down in Sussex, we got the RTK thing working. He had very good relations with John Deere, so we managed them to get their whiz kids out on the computers to make sure that their promise of being within an inch was actually true. And that got very successfully sorted out. So we can now mow on the RTK at about 8 kilometers an hour, and it's a huge bonus in terms of time. So that's a sort of field scale view. And you can see towards the end of the season, even on these very wide spacings, if there's decent fertility in the lay, it does tiller and start to close up those gaps a bit. And I was going to say PK, but fence post you could see there is about 1 meter 20. But the RTK had another whole load of implications, because the reason why I had the wide spacings to start with was so we could do a manual mow, low-tech manual mow. As you saw, the first mow was very low-tech indeed. And with the RTK, we don't need to do that anymore. So we're now redesigning the spacings. So we're going to do narrow strip till rows, wider spaces for the wheelings, you can see there, to keep everything super stable, because we're going to be mowing within an inch. And we still keep 57% of the field in perennial grasses, but it means that we're at a configuration of rows where there shouldn't really be any yield penalty at all. So we can use the inter-row mower to make sure that the inter-row light is colonized by the crop. But the other change to the system is the idea of a rotation on the rows themselves, because in France I was basing it on continuous wheat, on the idea that if you've got a herbal layer, or basically adding a grass into a diverse mixture of plants, and you can get the fertility from the legumes growing on the interrows. And partly also because down there no one sows any spring cereals at all because it gets too hot too fast. Whereas in the UK, there is obviously lots of spring sowing, and that opened up a really nice opportunity where, I mean, this is obviously not by any means set in stone, but you could sow the winter wheat alongside your herbal ley to begin the process. After harvest, you could sow some frost-sensitive nitrogen fixers and whatever you want to put in there, frost-sensitive, to make the spring sowing a little bit more easy. Those periods of the cover crops also allow the ley to fully express itself and develop and get the roots down deep. And then sow to spring oats, post-harvest graze back into winter wheat, repeat the same cover crop or change it a bit if you like, so you've got all the families of plants in there, going to, for example, spring barley. And at that point, depending on how things are looking, you could either just keep going and add some legumes back into the herbal ley strips if it's necessary, or you could move the whole system over and seed those strips down to grass and now start your cropping cycle where the grass was before. So to sort of sum up the farming bit, it was the idea of the perennial herbal leys is that they provide the diversity required for a regenerative model in as simple a way as possible. And because you're getting all the diversity from that part of the field, you can go into a relatively simple cereal cover crop rotation in the crop rows. We use the inter-row mower to manage competition when we're outside of the grazing window, and it's really about getting this symbiosis of annual plants, perennial plants and livestock in the same field. We've worked on ways to make this equipment affordable for people, and the system could be completed with the inclusion of agroforestry for those who want to do that. So that was the one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is this market for quality, and creating a situation where we can pay farmers really well for the quality of their produce and the ecosystems in which it's grown, so that we don't have to wait for everyone to set up a bakery or the equivalent. Because in a sane world, this is kind of the work of governments, in my opinion. But in the meantime, I just think we've got to get on with it. And so we're working very hard on ways of communicating to consumers that their food choices will determine the future. And actually, it's a very empowering message for people preoccupied with ecosystem and climate change worries, but haven't yet made the connection with the fact that the food that they choose is a response to that. And by choosing the right food, they become activists. And that's a message that is going down very well. If it's in your hands, you can do something about this. The 3 times a day you sit down to eat is your chance to act. So we're working very hard on that. One of our colleagues, George, is doing the same thing in schools. He's building a holistic education program around food and the soil. That's been running in a school in Barnet, and is now being all the experience from that taken away and sort of packaged up to be hopefully an easy to implement system for other schools. And the point of this market for quality is for anyone who's growing in a way which makes things better, basically, is that we can hopefully help farmers to take on risk and facilitate direction of travel. And it doesn't mean that everyone has to do the system that I was talking about. If people want to do that, then we'll provide the equipment for that and make it as easy as possible. But just to give one example, this is Nick Padwick up in Northumberland, who heard about the strip idea, and he wanted to do 3-metre strips, where he grazed and rather fabulously made silage on the strips either side of the crop rows. That was his version of the thing, which is fantastic. There's another very inspirational for me farmer in Norfolk called Nick Padwick. I'm going to embarrass him because I know he's here somewhere by putting his face on the screen. But it's been fantastic to work with him, and he's going to really lead the charge for us doing the Wildfarmed project in the Norfolk area. And in Nick's case, we're going to redesign the strip till and the inter-row mower to fit with the avatar. So there's many different ways you can achieve the same result. Alongside that, we're working along very many growers now who are in different phases of transition. It might start with planting wheat with beans or undersowing it with clover, or there can be a 2 or 3 year transition to the point of going into the full pasture cropping system. And the last thing that we're trying to do is some of the research that would have made my life a lot easier, at least. For example, just to give a few examples quickly, if you're trying to re-sow populations, Anders Borgen in Denmark, who's an amazing chap, but he did experiments about bunk control using a brush cleaner, so we've rerun his tests to confirm the results, and they were fabulous results, and so we're now working out how that can actually be incorporated into an easy-to-use cleaning line. Similarly, to do with disease control using vinegar, comparing that to mustard powder, actually doing that in the laboratory and seeing what that means. Testing some of the new seed treatments that claim all kinds of miracles and seeing what that actually means as well, so we can hopefully give some good advice on what's working and what isn't. And having conversations with DEFRA and ELMS about trying to find a way in which this pasture cropping system, where there's this symbiosis between livestock, annuals, perennials, how can we make it as easy as possible for the people adopting that system to attract the subsidies that we believe that they should for all the ecosystem services that are going to come out of that. So we're operating in a world where the price of food is completely illusory because it doesn't pay any of its bills, its climate bills, its ecological bills, its NHS bills. And yet we need to find a way of moving things forward in the world as it is. Similarly, in terms of the way the society is structured, land ownership, there's a million things that we might want to change and get better, and the model that we had in France, of which there are so many fabulous examples in the UK of the local farm, you know, feeding the local schools and so on, is fabulous. But my opinion is that if we wait for our countryside to be transformed into those micro farms of that type, the speed of the ecological and climate crises that are facing us means that we're going to run out of road. So the point of Wildfarmed project is to try and find a way that we can start creating change now at the kind of speed and scale that we need to do. And through this pasture cropping system that we try and make affordable, the inter-row mower to minimize risk, practical research, and consumer education, hopefully we can help do our bit to try and move the dial. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Okay, hi there. How do you find the grains that you've sort of developed genetically to suit France? How are they doing in the UK?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Well, actually, the population that was sown into that did best when we started sowing into grass has been growing at Goodwood for a long time now, and it's doing great down there. So there seems to be, I mean, I'm not the expert on this, but my limited experience of this is that when you start from a position of a large amount of genetic diversity, it will naturally change to suit its environment. But if there's sufficient diversity to begin with, then thus far it seems to have thrived.
Hi. How does the climate difference between sort of southwest France and the UK, was there challenges in implementing this kind of system with a more temperate, wet climate?
I think that well, the key difference could be perhaps grass growth. That would be, you know, and I think the thing with the inter-row mower is that we've got a way to deal with that, particularly now it's RTK and it's quick. And hopefully going forwards we can maybe look at some robotic options to get it even lighter and quicker. So I think that the inter-row mower is the key point of difference, because it may well mean that depending on where you are in the country and the rainfall that year, you have to do an extra mow. But we can, and it's not that, it doesn't make a massive difference to the margins. It'll probably cost about £25 a hectare to do an extra mow. So I think that, you know, with that to control that in my head, that's a significant difference between what's going on with this system and the mulch systems without any kind of inter-row control. That, you know, and in France as well, in very wet seasons, as you saw from the pictures of failure, things can get completely out of hand.
Hi, Andy. I've just got a question about yield of grain per acre. I suppose I should say thanks for saying where the grain came from. Since this is all about, we want to sequester as much carbon as we can, have you looked at the fuel input, the carbon impact, the carbon footprint of the whole system? Because mowing and all of those operations obviously require a bit of fuel and carbon, so we've got to balance that against food production. So do you feel very confident? It's a fascinating system. I mean,
yeah, no, I haven't done those calculations, and I think that the starting point is that we're direct drilling into a permanent pasture, a permanent living mulch, and from that point on, we're using the inter-row mower to guarantee that that system gets to the end of the cycle. And of course, those mowers will have some emissions, and I was just saying, there's some interesting things going on with robotics where we can hopefully get that right down and keep that as light as possible. But my opinion would be that those inter-row mowers are a reasonable compromise for the overall benefit of the system. But I haven't done the calculations, and yeah, we'd be interested to do that.
Hi, Andy. Great presentation. When you were going through your journey and you were thinking about, the journey of kind of a no-till or maybe Clifton Park and say 4-year herbal lay, 2-year cereals repeat or something like that, how did you balance out kind of obviously in a perfect world you'd say I've got a permanently living perennial thing and I'm drilling annuals into it, as you're trying to do, and that has its complexity challenges. Whereabouts did you kind of arrive at in terms of why you went down that road, as opposed to I'm building soil health for 4 years and I'm reluctantly cultivating, but it's an upward trajectory, with say 4 and 2 or something like that? What made you actually make the leap to pasture cropping?
No, that's a good question. I mean, because like, for example, where I'm going to be farming in the UK from September is not very far away from Helen Browning, who's doing a magnificent version of that. And it's demonstrably a great system and is achieving all kinds of ecosystem benefits and improving soil health and so on. I think it probably came from the fact that when I was looking at this from the perspective of really degraded soil that was teeming with at least visible life, I didn't analyse it underneath a microscope, but you could just see that the soil where the herbal lays were being compared to the annuals was just it was a different proposition, and just really not wanting to turn it upside down. It just felt too fragile, and to take all that soil biology and turn it upside down. I think that we can. Well, it's demonstrably the case that the Clifton system, it can maintain a functioning status quo. I think that if we can avoid the inversion of all that soil biology, maybe we can regenerate faster. And it's more kind of regeneration and sustainability that we need, certainly in the soils that I've been working on so far.
Hiya, I'm over here. Ooh.
Hi.
Hi. I'm interested in the kind of business proposition that you're making. How does it work when a farmer comes to you and says, yes, that looks fantastic, I want to do that, please? What is your offer in terms of machinery? And like, obviously you've described what the machinery is, but do you provide it and there's a kind of package, or how does that work?
There's different ways of doing it. There are people who are keen to help the project have said that they would put up the capital investment for the machinery, so then we could provide it to the farmer or a group of farmers on a per hectare price. So we could do that. There are other instances, like with Nick Padwick in Norfolk. We're working with the local river trust because we can attract grants for this kind of system if you're in a catchment zone. I'm not going to say any more on that because it's not my special subject, but yeah, so we can either go for a grant system. If the grants can't be had, then we can put up the capital so the farmers can lease it.
Hello. Hi, Andy.
Are you? I can't see you. Ah,
Hi.
hi.
I have two questions, one for my friend. I wondered if you're using any specific types of grains, any old-fashioned types in particular.
Yeah, no, we are. Well, I mean, we at the beginning when I started sowing these, as I was saying, you know, we swapped grains with Jean-Francois Berthelot, John Letts, Andy Forbes, Anders Borg, and all these people who've been doing this amazing work with the heritage grains. And I also swapped seeds with a local paysan boulanger, and we put all those into grass. And when we put it into grass, it was the local paysan boulanger population that did better. But actually, that's kind of irrelevant now, because that was in a zero disturbance into pasture situation. So it's a very, very, very competitive scenario. Whereas what we're doing now is strip tilling, effectively. So we're creating cultivated ground for the grains to go in, and that's what opens up the door to adding in barley, adding in oats, adding in spring wheat, and so on.
Do you mind if I ask a second question? I guess from that, if you do not know Andy yourself or John Letts, how do you get hold of these different types of grains? Because I know that it's illegal to buy them.
How do I get hold of them?
How does the room get hold of them?
Oh, I see. Yeah, well,
The royal we or the we.
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and it's not a straightforward answer. And we are speaking to the powers that be about how we can make this what should be a legalized process legal. And in the meantime, there are ways of getting around this problem, which we're not the first to explore. There are other groups like Hobmadods who've been doing this for a lot longer than we have, and it's about creating communities of growers, and we can work within that system. One thing that we are going to do, however, is do even though we can't legally certify the seed, we're going to do the full certification process, so that we do all the kind of as if it was going to go to get stamped, except it just won't have the final stamp.
Hi, Andy. Hi. Great presentation. Thank you very much. I actually just wanted to pick up on your brilliant phrase, which was about consumer activism and trying to make consumers be as powerful as they can in making their food choices, which after all we all do every single meal we decide to eat. Every time we make a food choice, we are supporting a particular method of production. I just wanted to tell you, Andy, about a campaign which actually we're launching at 4 o'clock called Clear, and it's basically campaigning for the government to implement mandatory method of production labelling so that every single piece of food, wherever you buy it, whoever you are, will one day have a label on it which tells you, scores it in some way, about how that piece of meat or vegetable or pie or whatever you're eating was produced. And it would be great, maybe, you might like to join the consortium. There are about 40 of us already members, and we're asking everyone to sign a petition at Groundswell. So there will be more about that later on, but it'd be great to have a chat with you about that at some point.
Oh, we'd love to do that. Yeah, we'll definitely. Whereabouts is it at 4 o'clock?
I don't actually know.
We'll find you. We'll find you.
I'll tell you what, it's at the beginning of the regenerative agriculture one.
Oh, it's in here.
Oh, it's in here.
I'm reliably
Yeah,
informed
so
it's in here. Yeah.
Jimmy from the PFLA is going to launch it.
Yeah. Great.
That's excellent. Anybody else? Any other questions?
I think there's one.
Oh, there's one here.
After this one, I would like to hand over to my friend John Medley, who's going to do a little talk about farming with crotches. I think it's really important that people hear that.
A very quick one. I just want to know what's the yield of the grains you produce every year from your field, because I think farmer would like to know about that in order to buy in your system.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's quite hard to estimate because it's so highly variable. So where I am in France, standard organic yield will be about 2 tons, and a conventional yield will be about 5. And so it's always going to be relative to that. So the best guess is about 40% of a conventional yield. That seems to be the way it's working. What's that?
Every year, she's saying.
Yeah. It's when I've been doing the continuous wheat in France, it's about 40% of conventional yield.
Andy, thank you so much. Please can we show our appreciation for that?
You're welcome. It's with great pleasure that I hand over to John, who I was lucky enough to meet 2 or 3 years ago, 4 years ago, and who's been a real source of inspiration about all things to do with pasture, made all kinds of introductions, and he's here to talk about a rather miraculous subject, as you will soon see.
Thank you very much, Andy, for a very, very inspiring talk. And I had the privilege of spending 3 or 4 days down with Andy and with Nina, who's down here, down at Narok. And thank you for listening. The Farming with Crutches is officially been supported by Groundswell and its initiative that I've spent the last, can't believe it really, the last 50 years working in rural Asia and Africa. I met many, many inspiring people, and this group is one of them. So let me take you first to Sierra Leone, which, if you don't know, is on the west coast of Africa there. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. Lots of people live on £1 a day. I first went there in 1979. In the 1990s, there was a terrible civil war in which tens of thousands of people got killed, and children became victims. Lots of them lost their limbs through a machete or a stray bullet or a landmine. And in 2001, an amazing young guy called Mahmoud Samai, you'll meet in a moment, he started this organization called the Sierra Leone Amputee Sports Association, with the idea of bringing together amputees so that they could play football. I can't show you the video, we don't have time, but it's quite extraordinary to see them. And I took my son Tom, who was then 16, just finished his GCSEs, to Sierra Leone in 2012 and met them on the beach. And I spent 2001, 2002 working in rural Sierra Leone when the war was coming to an end, trying to help to rebuild the rural economy. And we met Mahmoud, and in 2014 they got through to the finals of the World Cup in Mexico. There was a World Cup, believe it or not, of amputee footballers, and then Ebola came, and they were not able to go. Now in 2010, the UN Secretary General, like me, was utterly impressed when he went to Sierra Leone and he saw these guys, girls as well, boys and girls, playing football on the beach. And he gave them 10 acres of land for football and to develop for entrepreneurship. And they had no money. I mean, these people live literally on fresh air. And in 2018, Mahmoud had the chance to go to the Asian Rural Institute, an amazing place in Japan, and learn about permaculture. And he came back full of enthusiasm to develop this 10 acres of land, but they had no money. Anyway, last January, February, we managed to raise £20,000 from the Lush Foundation, and they started work. And here they are putting up the bamboo fences. There you can see the sweet potato farm and some of the staff. They put in, they dug a well, they put in solar power, the trickle irrigation you can see going in there. It's wholly organic, no inputs at all. And those of you who don't have the Soil Mentor app, be ashamed, because these guys have the app and they're monitoring their soils. So here they are making compost to feed the seedlings. You can see them there. There's Lahai Makir on his crutches, feeding peppers with the bokashi. And this is what it's like to work on crutches in the maize on the right, making compost. And if you want to see this guy, this guy's got one leg, and on the left, and his crutch is his other leg, and you can see with two hands he's harvesting peanuts. So this is, this farm's only, at that time, had only been going for a few months. So they're bringing in school kids, just like Andy was doing. They're bringing school children onto the farm, and they're teaching them compost making, harvesting, seed saving, the dignity of labor. They're bringing farmers in to teach them about permaculture, organic farming, how to grow a food forest. All of this has been achieved in 15 months from a standing start, from a bare piece of land in the dry season at a cost of £25,000, probably the cheapest electric car. And they've done it entirely by hand. There isn't a single machine on that farm, and they've done it during a pandemic. Lovely people. So they're trying to raise £50,000, which is twice what they've had so far. And the first thing you want to do is to bring 15 amputees together, and these amputees are then going to design their own training course about how to be an amputee farmer. They then want to bring in 35 more amputees to be trained in the course that's been designed by their peers. They then want to bring in 240 school kids who can learn all about permaculture, organic farming, and then go and persuade their parents to do the same. 150 farmers to bring them in, and then 20 what we call change makers or extension officers to live in the villages. Now, what's important about this is, apart from them being on crutches, is this is all about farming in harmony with nature. There are no purchased inputs. They save their own seed, they produce their own compost, their own bokashi. And this is because one of the curses in Africa with small farms is that people are encouraged to buy hybrid seed, to buy artificial fertilizer and pesticides, and then they have flood, they have drought, they have locusts, and they get into debt. So this is about trying to farm without credit, without people getting into debt. Total cost, £50,000. That's £100 per beneficiary. Or if we say there could be 10 persons influenced by that, 5,000 people, that would be £10 per head. An extraordinary thing. So there they are. So if you want to support them, there's a chip and pin machine. Actually, it's at the merchandising centre, not the PFLA, much though I'd love you to go to the PFLA site. There's a chip and pin there. Or, as you can see, and there are some leaflets which you can get from me here, you can go to the Groundswell's website at bit.ly. I've done one of these short things, quite techie really, called bit.ly.farmingoncrutches. So if you want a mnemonic and you're talking to your partner, it is beintouch.loveyou/farmingoncrutches. Thank you very much.